So, I'm going to be talking about introverts in poetry. The definition of an introvert is someone who's reserved and quiet and tends to be introspective and enjoys spending time alone. But that's just a sliver of a big concept. Introversion versus extroversion was introduced by Carl Jung in 1910. Some characteristics that describe an introvert are someone who has a small circle of really, really close friends, someone who would prefer a movie night versus going out to a big party, someone who has comfort in being alone and having inner thoughts and feelings versus external. Sometimes poets will seclude themselves, like Henry David Thoreau. He lived in a small cottage in the middle of nowhere away from humanity for a while to understand the purpose of society. Not only will poets be introverts, they'll add that concept into their poems. And I have four poets who do that. Emily Bronte, don't know how to say her last name, but we learned about her. Her most prominent writings have been centered around the idea of seclusion and introversion. Her poem, I'm Happiest When Away, is talking about leading up to the moment of finally being alone. She was one of six children, so I'm sure the house was really hectic, and the story talked about her happiness when she finally got to that state of alone and tranquility. Some things that could have caused her to be an introvert were her dad wanting her to have creative interest in independent learning that lowered the amount of socialization that she had compared to other kids. Then there's Emily Dickinson, who was an American poet. She wasn't discovered till after her death, but she had a poem called The Brain, and it was just talking about the expansiveness of the brain and how you can just disappear into your own inner thought, and she found comfort in that. Um, an explanation to her introvertedness is the loss of loved ones. Her mother was ill, and she was taking care of her for a very long time, and even after her death, she stayed just at the house because that's what she knew. And it didn't help that the rest of the townspeople thought she was crazy because she was a woman in the mid 1800s writing poetry. She had a close circle. She really only talked to her family that she lived with, her sister in law, and two people that she would send letters to about her poetry. The third is Alexander Pope. He wrote in the 18th century, but he wasn't read until about the 20th century because in the 18th century he wasn't very liked because he was a Catholic. He didn't have a formal education because he had a bad health status. He had spinal tuberculosis at 12, and that inhibited a lot for him. But he had this poem called Ode of Solidarity, which basically said that the happiest people to live are the people who live a simple solitude life. And by the end of the poem, he just talked about how he wanted just to go through the motions of life. He wanted to be out of sight, out of mind, and behind the scenes of everything. He did not want attention, and that is a big characteristic of an introvert, not wanting attention. Then the last person is William Wordsworth. He was one of the founders of Romanticism, and he was an advocate for the common man. He went to Cambridge and had a really good, big vocabulary, but he wrote in a way that everyone could understand his message. He had a poem called I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, and that just talked about how being alone doesn't necessarily mean loneliness. Sometimes when you say, oh, I'm going to be alone or whatever, it has like a negative connotation to it, and he just kind of debunked that. Some explanation to him being an introvert is the death of his mother at 8 years old, which is a really important age, and with the death of his mother was the separation from his best friend, who is his sister, who for some reason went to go live with relatives. And a loss like that can cause uh, introvertedness in someone. So yeah, voila, that is the end of my presentation.